Hello, and welcome back to the Journey NYC podcast. I'm Anthony, and this
Jesse.
is...
I'm Jesse.
Hi, Jesse.
We flubbed that one.
I know,
cool.
Completely.
We'll get it right one of these days. I think.
Whatever. We've got, 1,000 more episodes to do?
Yeah, around that.
Anyway, so we are here today. I've got a really interesting... I don't want to call it guest today versus a subject. Let's just introduce him to everybody. This is Emery Kash. Emery, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, amazing. And he's got that sexy accent too. Mm-hmm. I know that works.
Americans love the British accent.
Yeah.
You know what? It's treated me well, I have to admit. Yeah, for sure.
You're like ordering a coffee at Starbucks and everyone's like, oh my God.
Yeah. A lot of free stuff bringing this way.
You sure it wasn't just a smile and a wink? You sure it was the actual accent?
I put all my eggs in the basket, see what works,
Anyway, Emery actually comes to us from England. We met a few months ago. And then obviously we've been chatting with real people about real shit. Talking through the Journey NYC podcast, we talk a lot through everyone's personal journeys and whatnot. And I think yours is probably one of the most interesting and engaging that I've heard in a while. So why don't we start it off by saying this? Emery, you were actually born Emma.
Yep.
And you were born as Emma. Tell us a little bit about what your early childhood was like.
Definitely, yeah. I was born female. I was born in Manhattan, but after 6 months, yes, actually, surprisingly, I know not many people know that. I was born here.
Cool.
Yeah, and but after 6 months, my family moved to Singapore, which I spent 17 years growing up in Singapore. And yeah, that was a really particular experience. Singapore is a small island in Southeast Asia. It is extremely conservative in terms of a lot of its politics and culturally. And so growing up there was kind of very isolating for a lot of reasons. And I think specifically when I'm thinking about my journey through my gender, it was a really difficult time to really see or find examples of people going through what I felt like I was going through. So, it's illegal to be gay in Singapore, so any other forms of queerness is really not visible at all. And
wait, still?
Yes, it's still.
Is it a Muslim country?
It is not a Muslim country, but it's definitely got its conservative roots in.
Got it.
And. So I think, growing up, I had these feelings of being kind of different in not feeling so connected with my body and my gender. For example, I would, in the first grade, like early years, I would be at home and I would make my family call me Jason, and I would like have this life where I was living as a little boy. And then I would go to school and, my name was Emma and I was like living as like this little girl in this context. So for a few years, I lived in sort of this double life, and I was really blessed to have a mother and a sister who were really kind of just supportive and letting me do my thing and being the weird child that I was, and kind of that existed until I hit puberty, when I realized that my fate was to be what it was. Yeah. And I kind of just was like, well, I guess, I was born a woman, so I'm going to have to just play this role now. And so...
How long... I have a really quick question.
Yes.
Excuse me. How long did your parents or your mother and your sister keep calling you Jason?
I would say for like 3 or 4 years until I really... until it just became like I was old enough that I couldn't really be like playing so much. It didn't seem like normal at that age for a child to be doing this. At that point, I was just like considered Emma the tomboy. I was like always like skateboarding and hanging out with boys and doing like tomboy things.
Cool.
Yeah. And so, yeah, then after, hitting puberty and going through it, I kind of just really lent into being a woman. I was really, I try to really celebrate what that meant. I had a sister who was really, gorgeous and she is, and really feminine.
I think you showed me a couple pictures and you're beautiful.
Thank
as
you.
well.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that's often something that's really difficult with the trans experience is that we have these beautiful things about us, you know, and experiences that we feel like if we transition or when we transition, we lose that and we sacrifice that. And I think, you know, that's potentially true in some ways. But I think that what is grown and what is potentially like achieved by transitioning is so much greater than what is lost, hopefully.
Sure.
And so, yeah.
Okay, so as a child, you wanted to be known as Jason. They sort of entertained that for for 3 or 4 years, whatever that was. Then you leaned into being a female. What I think for myself is my question is what was going on with your family? Because I know for myself is I would probably be like, I wonder why my child wants to be called Jason, or why does my sister want to be known as Jason, and what is that like, and how does that affect the dynamic? Because they're gonna know that you're different. I don't necessarily think it's weird. Like I had an imaginary friend when I was a kid. I still have one. No, anyway, but you know, I think they must have known something was different. Especially it's not out of the realm of possibility for a parent to sense when my child is struggling.
Totally.
So,
Totally.
I mean, what was that like?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I mean, I think this idea of struggle is interesting because I felt like for a long time it didn't feel like a struggle because the environment that my family set up made it feel normal. Like I didn't ever feel othered. I think part of it, when I reflect and talk to my mom now and my sister and my family, part of it was that my mom, for example, she didn't want to make a problem where there wasn't one, right?
Sure.
And I think for young people and like young children, she was like, oh, maybe my child is just playing and going through whatever and they'll grow out of it. You know, like most kind of parents would probably think. I also think that part of it was just not wanting to think that something was wrong, do you know, as well. So like if I just play along, then eventually it will all be fine and we don't really have to think about it. So I would say that, you know, despite the fact that I did grow up in a really loving and liberal space, it wasn't like I was having conversations with my family about my identity or I was having intentional sort of explorations of this. And it wasn't really until, honestly, I was about 18 or 19 that I was able to fully articulate to my mom and my sister what it really was that I was experiencing and what my identity sort of is.
In terms of like, you're living in a very, very conservative political, I guess, climate, but how did that color your experience growing up? Because it sounds like you had a great family that was really just like, you know what, you're young and you're like figuring things out, and that's cool, and like you do you, and that's great, and like that's an awesome environment to grow up. But like you contrast that with living in this kind of like archaic, really conservative society. How did that color your view of things?
I think that's a really interesting question. I've been trying to think about that too, because I think a lot of it has been unlearning like internalized homophobia and transphobia due to lack of visibility of people who are successfully queer, right? I think that like I grew up seeing gayness and queerness and transness as a form of not being successful or being deviant from the norm. And you know, I really didn't have many positive queer figures until I moved to the US and I started to see my professors who were queer or just people around me who are living these full, like authentic lives and were also, you know, gay or trans or, you know, whatever their situation was. So yeah, I think that lack of visibility really hindered my own positive notions of what my life could be or what I could be.
Right, kind of lacking of role models. In
totally,
a sense.
exactly.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity too, you mentioned that it was illegal to be gay. What
yeah.
I mean, what is the actual like?
So Singapore is like an extremely well-run ship. So corporal punishment is involved. So there's, you know, you can be fined.
Everything's corporal punishment, right?
Yeah. So
that's
like,
crazy.
yeah, and anything like, you know, throwing your gum or trash on the floor, you get fined for it. So there's this sense of order. So, you know, illegal. It becomes a cultural thing. You don't want to break the rules, and one of the rules is, for example, like no PDA in public, so you won't see queerness in that way. You can't get married. You don't have any like legal rights as a couple. I think that, you know, I grew up, I lived in Singapore from 1996 to 2012. So that period, you know, early 2000s, it was queerness was still sort of really undercover in a lot of ways in that space.
It feels like it's only in the last like 5 to 8 years. I don't know what's changed, but it seems like there's so much more awareness now. And maybe it was social media and just like the inclusion of everyone having a voice, whereas maybe people weren't allowed or given the chance to speak. You know, we now have an ability to like hear from people that have been kind of marginalized, I think.
Totally. One of the key ways that I remember sort of being sheltered from queerness was through censorship of media. So like I remember watching like Glee episodes as a kid and not understanding the storyline because they would cut out a lot of, you know, of the story. Yeah, and like especially the queer storylines. So it's interesting your point, because I think that it's been harder and harder to have that control over what people are seeing because of the different ways that queerness is permeating culture and online spaces.
Well, I think also, you know, in the last 5 years, as Caitlyn Jenner came out, you know, and that was such a huge thing, looking, you know, at the stage of an Olympic champion to becoming something else, and being a part of such a huge media machine such as the Kardashians. So I think that was also a great way for the trans community and the queer community to really sort of see outside. Which leads me to, you know, want to ask the question, you know, is society in general likes to categorize things. You're gay, you're bi, you know, it's like you hear gay people talking about there's no such thing as bi. You're either gay, you know, and everybody wants to categorize something and put it in a neat little box that we understand. How, when you look at that, like, how do you explain things such as transgender, transsexual, transgendered? Maybe you can give our listeners a little bit of a education on what it's like and what those things mean.
Totally. Yeah, I think language is so important because it does like help us relate to each other as well, right?
Sure.
I think that, so in terms of the history of the language of transgender, transsexual is actually an older term used for transgender people. From what I understand, and I think different people in different communities sort of co-opt this in different ways, but from what I understand, transgender is like the umbrella term, and then transsexual can be someone who falls under that term. Personally, I feel uncomfortable claiming the identity of transsexual because for me, I read transsexual as the traversing of your like sex. And I don't think I'm doing that. Like, for me, my sex will always be female. I will always have female chromosomes. And for me, that's what sex is. But gender is this thing that lives above that for me. And that's the thing that I'm traversing across. That's... I'm going from a woman to a man in my experience. I sort of understand my experience as a transgender person to be, I kind of like to explain it a little bit like the gender in my head doesn't match the body that I have, right? And so I'm trying to like align those two things. Some trans people have a problem with thinking about being transgender like that. People think that seems to be like self-hating, like, oh, I was born in the wrong body and now I'm having to fix it. But I mean, I have to admit that's like what I feel. That's kind of been my experience. I feel uncomfortable being seen as a woman in social settings. I feel uncomfortable being a woman in the world. And as I've transitioned medically and started to take testosterone and started to be seen in the world as male, that is further confirmed for me because I feel more comfortable in this, presenting this way.
That's interesting. So going from Emma to then Emery, what happened to Jason?
What happened to Jason? Oh my God, what happened to Jason?
I would have thought
Seriously,
that you would be Jason.
Poor guy. No, I think the reason I chose the name Jason was because we were at this store and they had like keychains, and they, you know how they have like names on keychains, and I was like, I'm just gonna take this one. So I didn't really have an attachment to the name.
Oh, got it.
But actually, the way I came to have the name Emery was my sister Bella, who I'm really close with. I live with her. She's 3 years younger than me. She's been like one of my biggest advocates in my family and just in life. So her and I were in a swimming pool in Cancun. We were just like swimming, and I was telling her, you know, I want to change my name. And she was the first person that I sort of came out to. And she was like, you know, you should go with Emery. I feel like you look like an Emery, and you know, you want to keep like the EM beginning of your name. And so she kind of helped me come to that conclusion. And it's kind of nice that it was
a joint decision.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And then so she's the first person that you told. You then start, I guess, thinking about it is what I would assume. I'm assuming that there's this huge journey that happens from what you realize to the time when you're ready to emotionally and then publicly state it. And that means telling your family, telling those people that you're close to, so that you can then, you know, find support, so to speak.
Exactly.
What was that? And, you know, what was the timeline like? What was that journey like?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it came to me finding language and talking to other trans and queer people and hearing about their experience. So really, when I started to seriously consider my gender and consider my identity was when I was in university. It was the first time I lived away from home. I was around, like, you know, the university that I went to was Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and it's a typical small liberal arts, very liberal space, you know, ton of queer people loving themselves. So no other place to find yourself as another queer person. And so, yeah, I just was around people who were having bold conversations and being really real about who they were. And I started to relate to a lot of the things they were saying. So I started going to sort of queer events at clubs, and then also just at like different community centers to further find out, you know, what was going on, what are the opportunities here.
Being a fly on the wall.
Exactly. And kind of going back to this idea of like, people do live these lives and they are successful. I think like I had heard so many really tragic trans stories, and it created this notion in my mind that like I was going to be choosing this. If I like go through with this transition, if I really accept that I'm trans, then I'm accepting that I'm a failure, and I'm accepting that like this life of like second class living. And I was just like blown away by so many people that I was able to meet who were completely shattering that perception that I had. You know, these were like men and women, trans men and women with families, with jobs, with like just living the life. And it just gave me a lot of confidence to further kind of explore myself.
I think one of the interesting things that I think people, and I know even for myself, is you start looking, we forget that being raised as kids and being raised in a family, some of the things that we're raised with are what we're seen as. And then we create this story in our head. We're going to do this. We have to, you know, achieve these things by this age. I thought I'd be married by 25 or whatever that is, and have this many kids or whatever it is. And we have these stories that become a part of who we see ourselves as. And when you come to the realization that I'm transgendered, I'm gay, I'm different, I'm whatever it is, then you have to rewrite all of that. And part of that internal journey is what starts to happen. And I think it starts by a person, you know, getting to the point where they go outside of what their norm was and start opening their eyes to what is possible. And I think that's what's interesting. So what kind of timeline was that? From the time that you told your sister Bella to the point where you're now in university, and or maybe it all happened at the same time, but what did that timeline look like?
Yeah, so I was, I guess I started to realize that I actually first came out as gay to my family when I was 19, and I had like my first queer relationship, and it was kind of like a breath for my family, I think, because they'd always like figured something was up, right, with this like tomboy and Jason, what the hell's going on? So sorry, one second. So when I came out, that was kind of like, it was, everyone thought the puzzle was solved, right? And then as I sort of came out and was comfortable in my gayness at the time, that's when I started to hang out more in queer spaces and start to meet more queer people. So this was, again, I was like 19, 20. And then at that point, I would say it wasn't long. I would say like by the time I was 20, I kind of realized like, okay, I see so much of my experience in the trans people around me and the sort of research that I'm doing. And so I kind of started to do small things. Like I cut my hair one Christmas, I cut it really short. And it was kind of this moment of like releasing a lot of this femininity that I had. I don't know if you remember, I had really long hair.
And beautiful
yes.
hair.
My mom used to braid it every morning. It was like kind of this thing that was it was attached to my identity in so many ways.
Sure.
So I cut it off. And that was the first shock, I think, for like my family. I started to present more masculine. I wore like male clothes. I was a bit more unapologetically myself in a lot of ways. But I still didn't use the language of trans, and I still wasn't talking about medically transitioning or anything.
Did you realize that by that point?
Yeah.
Because you had come out, what is the timeline from the point where you came out as gay, quote unquote gay,
Yeah.
to the point where you are now getting to this point where you're like, something still isn't right. How do I get to this next, the next point where now I am transgendered?
Yeah, I would say it was like within a year of like coming
okay.
out. I'd always known I liked girls, right? And I had always known I was trans, but I think the language and the sort of like confidence was within a year of like making that public for everyone. Yeah. And I kind of held off telling my family that I wanted to medically transition, even though I'd known for about a year or so before telling them, because I didn't want them to, I wanted to go in with as much ammo and information and like confidence as I could. And because I knew that what I was going to say and what I was going to do was going to be a massive thing. And I wanted to be equipped for like the sort of rebuttals and the sort of like, are you sure this is really what you want? What happens if this? What about this? So I gave myself a year to really do my research, figure it out, make sure it was really what I wanted for myself before I started letting other people in and letting other opinions in.
I think what's interesting is even as a gay individual, coming out is such a process that is so much longer than just an instant. And the world is privy to that instant of where that coming out happens, but they don't see all the work that goes into it before, which is sort of funny that we're talking about it on The Journey because it literally is this journey and you collecting information. It's this point of where an individual has to learn to accept themselves, figure out what's not okay, figure out what is going to be okay, and then how am I going to get there? But then to build enough confidence and humility and compassion for yourself to actually take that journey to get to that next point. And I think that's what's so remarkable. Yeah,
I think too, it's a journey that's different in that not everyone faces the same challenges, but the overall like arc of the story, which is like there's a lot going on behind the scenes. There's a lot that you're dealing with that's not public, that's not in your family, or it's just kind of in your own head at the time, to getting to the point where you're ready to accept, like you talked about, like so much fear around acceptance, because like, what does that mean? Like, I'm going to become this thing that I never wanted to be, kind of, and I'm holding on so tight to my identity. And then finally coming to acceptance, realizing that it's not bad. It's a good thing that you're being true to yourself, and then moving on from there. And like that arc of that story could be transferred to so many others of folks that come in with many different other experiences. We're all human. We all kind of handle the same type of journey, I guess, in a way, without beating that word to death. But the one thing I wanted to point out too is that like when you're talking about this terminology, like the way, and correct me if I'm wrong, the way I view it is like there's basically like 3 layers. Like you are born male or female. Generally, it's kind of a binary thing. And then there's the gender, which I would say is like on top of that, which is like, how do you associate with the world? Like, do you feel that you are male or female? right? Regardless
Yep.
of what the sex parts are at birth.
Yes.
And then on top of that, there's your sexuality, right? So do you like male, female, both? And then that's like kind of the next layer on top of those two other layers, right? So like when you said, and do I have that? I mean,
Yes, that sounds
so
sounds
like
really
when you say that, like you went to your family and said that like I'm gay, that was your personal story, but there are transgender people that would probably that don't associate themselves necessarily as gay.
Totally,
right? That
totally.
they are interested in the opposite sex. It gets a little bit more confusing as you start to kind of go up the ladder towards these different like associations or like what we're viewing ourselves as in relation to the world. And I think that's where people start to get really like confused, and my perspective is like, although it's not like what classically is taught to us in schools or whatever, like the humanality of it is that like I think we're all the same in that aspect, and that like it just requires, I think, for people to think a little bit outside of what they are like rigidly beholden to in their own thought process.
Totally.
And kind of letting that go a little bit. Which I think a lot of that has changed in the past, like even like 5 years, socially speaking.
Totally.
Agreed. And I actually think that what you just said makes it so easy to sort of look at, maybe not necessarily understand, but I think one of the things that, is the public in general always, and I remember as it used to go through my head, wait, and you just clarified this because you just said, when I first came out, I came out as gay, because then the next thing is but you're still not comfortable in your body. So then it becomes you're transgendered. But then when somebody first gets to meet you and you're a transgendered man who has a girlfriend, you're like, the first thing that I think so they were a lesbian first, and that, because I think what you just said, Jesse, makes it very clear. There are 3 different layers. There's who you were born as, there's who you identify as, and then there's who am I attracted to? And I think that's what's such an amazing, that's brilliant, my friend.
Truly.
Very easy to understand.
Exactly. And then I think it also allows, as you're sort of saying, to think about how those things in conversation with each other, right? So that's when like this language comes in. So thinking about like...
And almost like when the like it's important, but then you realize how unimportant it really is at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Because like when you start miring yourself down and like, well, what are you? It's like, I'm a human being. Like, I mean, like you can get all these classifications and, oh, well, on this, and this. And like, I think there's a huge issue in our society today of labeling people and of not being able to see the humanity in other people, but instead potentially out of fear or just ignorance saying, oh, well, you're just this, that, or the other thing. It could be politics, it could be sexuality, it could be really anything is becoming like more and more polarized and more. And what's odd to me is that it's in the face of this like new resurgence of information. Like we now know much more about gender and sexuality than we ever did before, yet we are even more inclined to try to label people and to try to like oversimplify things. So they're happening at the same time, I think.
So true. I think you're right. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So sorry, to get back to you. Yeah. So you now are in the process of transitioning fully to male.
Yeah.
And when did that start for you?
I think so. This section is typically called like medical transition. So there's like a social transition, which happens, whenever someone starts to present. And I would say I started my social transition like 2 years before I started my medical transition. And so I actually went to the UK first to try to get on hormones. And in the UK, there's a slightly different process than in the US. So in the UK, you have to prove that you are transgender, and they have a certain sort of rubric in which they have to tick the boxes. And so you have to go and talk to therapists. You have to prove that you're living a certain way, your family or whoever is seeing you a certain way. I went through that process for about 6 months, and I kind of felt like I was going crazy because I felt like the professionals were trying to negotiate me out of my identity. They were trying to tell me or trying to make me prove something, and I'm already confused. Like,
Did you ever get an explanation as to like why you needed to prove these things?
Yeah, I think it's because they don't want people who aren't trans getting on these hormones and who are confused about their identity. I think it's really, I mean, it's a huge space of sort of tension in the community, because there's some people who really do believe that it should be difficult to get on hormones, because you don't want anyone just thinking that they're trans because it's popular on Instagram or whatever their thoughts may be, or their kids have been corrupted by whatever. And so there's like this massive gatekeeping that happens. And it also, what it allows too is then if you do qualify as a transgender person, you have access to resources that are quite plentiful, because there's not many people who have access. Whereas in the US, and the reason I came back here to go through my medical transition, is that it's actually much more on a like consensual basis. So you still have to talk to a therapist, you still have to have medical professionals involved, but I can go to a center and say, look, I'm having these feelings. I believe that I'm transgender. We talk about it for a bit, and then they tell me the risks of me taking the hormone that I want to take, and then I consent to that risk. And to me, that's a much more civil, I guess, way of doing it, because I felt like I still felt supported and that I had information, but I didn't feel like I was this test subject who was like having to parade in front of people who were not transgender and were telling me that I might not be.
Right, and having to defend your...
That's, yes.
Yeah, and it's also so ironic that we can prescribe like extremely addictive opioids after getting like a root canal, yet
so easily.
So easily. Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's true. Totally. And I was someone who was very skeptical of the medical institution. One of the reasons that one of the things I was really dealing with when thinking about medically transitioning was this idea that I would have to take this medication for the rest of my life. Like I would be dependent on this synthetic thing forever. And that really bothered me. And honestly, it still kind of does, because I feel like I have these moments of like, well, if I can't have access to this because of whatever reason,
sure,
like that's good.
Or it takes you somewhere that's not.
Yeah, it's going to be really difficult. But again, I feel like the amount of happiness and fulfillment I've felt from taking this drug, and the more that I feel myself, it's worth it. I have stories of like, traveling with testosterone is a trip, because I mean, going through TSA as a trans person is already like a traumatizing experience, because it's a very gendered experience.
Yeah.
So, and then, you have to be like touched down and, all this stuff. But I had an incident where my testosterone was taken from me at an airport, and then sort of publicly in front of a lot of people, I had to explain why I needed to take this drug and what it was and who I was. And, I'm not ashamed of being trans. I'll talk to anyone about it if they're going to be respectful. But I think for me in that moment, it was more a feeling of like, well, now all these strangers know my identity quite intimately. And if I go into a bathroom, and I'm going to use a male bathroom, and let's say someone else was there who saw me as a trans person, and
sure,
they're not feeling it, I become vulnerable in that space. So
sure,
it's just about sort of the sensitivity and the...
It's completely understandable. I mean, it's nobody else's business.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there are different ways in which we become visible, and that becomes uncomfortable. But yeah.
So now you're a couple of years into the medical process?
Actually, yeah. So yeah, I'm actually only 9 months. I started taking testosterone last year. And so the first year is sort of the biggest load. It's like going through a second puberty. I've noticed, like, for example, my voice really dropped. I know, and I have a voicemail. My voicemail's still from like high school, and whenever Anthony would call me, and yeah, he reminded me that that's old. But nevertheless, I've also noticed that my fat distribution has really changed. I used to have a lot more fat in my hips and my chest, which have like changed. I get muscle a lot more quickly and easily.
Pretty awesome.
Pretty like all the cool stuff. Yeah, I also get like acne and
Yeah.
all the other things that come with puberty, mood swings and stuff. But overall, I just feel like great. Yeah,
Yeah, it's really cool.
yeah.
So 9 months in, what does this first segment look like? You know, when you're medically transitioning, is it a year? Is it 2 years?
Yeah, I think about after it depends on each body, but I think after about 2 years, your body kind of stabilizes and you stop going through this like puberty stage. And you kind of like, you still have to inject your hormone, regularly. I inject into my stomach every week, but
It's once a week.
once a week, but there are different types of testosterone that different people take. Mine happens to be every week. And yeah, so after 2 years, I'll continue to do that weekly, but hopefully the sort of changes that I'm seeing in my body will stabilize.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, okay, so now you're medically transitioning, and obviously your voice is changing.
Yeah.
Your jawline has changed. Your physicality changes.
Yeah.
How is your family and your support network and like your friends? How do they respond to all of this?
Yeah, I think it's a really complex time because I think when you transition medically and socially, but medically,
Sure.
You have to renegotiate like every relationship you've ever had, right?
Absolutely.
Like because and unless you just meet the person. So, and growing up in Singapore, I have a lot of friends who are still there, who grew up there, who grew up in the same sort of conservative places I did. And I think I've been really surprised as to the amount of support and public sort of celebration of my identity that I've received. And I think it goes back to your point about where we've come as a sort of society in terms of accepting queer and trans people. So amongst people my own age, I've noticed like very little issues with people. I would say that in terms of my family and people who are a little bit older than me, I think there was definitely a sense of concern and confusion, right?
Sure.
Like, does this person really know what they're getting into? They're 22 years old. How do they know that this is right for them? Things change and stuff like that. So I got a lot of questions like that from my family. Also, my family is Punjabi Sikh, and they still live in a pretty conservative community in the UK. And so I think that there's also a slight sense of having to negotiate those cultural realities, which is that being queer and trans is not normal, and it's kind of like there aren't many people in my community that are like me. But again, I have to say that after having really thoughtful conversations with my family members, them really wanting to understand where I'm coming from and who I am, they've become, people who've really supported me and
We're proponents for you.
exactly.
And I think that was when I was first telling Jesse about having met you and having this conversation, it was really to try to demystify what I think people tend to just keep in their head versus actually hearing it firsthand and really understanding a little bit more about what does it mean, to be transgendered? What do they go through? Because I think that's where we as human beings can actually connect and come together as a race.
Totally.
Just so that we can demystify a lot of the questions that sometimes people are not able to ask. And you and I chatted a fair bit about, topics around what was comfortable, what was not. How did you, not just negotiate yourself, negotiate your family relationships and your support and even your friends.
Yeah.
And what that journey has been like. And that's been really interesting to hear as well. So you also, through this process, and you've now been on testosterone for 9 months, and you also have a girlfriend.
Yeah.
Who's quite beautiful. Do you have to also negotiate that as your physicality changes?
That's a really interesting question. In terms of my relationship with her.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say that when I first started thinking socially transitioning and physically transitioning, I was actually with someone else. And I would say that something I noticed that I did in that relationship was I would use her femininity to validate my masculinity, and to use her, like, the ways in which she kind of presented as female as a way to, like, be like, oh yeah, like, this girl wants me, so I'm obviously, like, I can be a dude, and things like that. And that was a really unhealthy way to negotiate who I was and, like, my identity and what it means for me to be a man and things like that. So there was a period where I just was, I didn't really want to date anyone. I wanted time to really figure out who I was. And then now in relationships, and now I think I have a much more centered way of trying to negotiate when my body's changing in relationship to her. So, for example, I'm way more confident in my body and in who I am, and so I don't let other things get in the way of that. So, I think before, I was really self-conscious about, I feel uncomfortable in my body. I feel uncomfortable in, like, how people see me and see me with you in terms of, like, relationships. But with now, I'm just a little bit more relaxed about it all, I would say.
So, like, through time, it sounds like we learn more self-compassion, which then bleeds out into the people that we surround ourselves with.
It's a beautiful way to put it, yeah.
So when you look at, if let's say is one of our listeners happens to be someone who doesn't identify with the gender that they were born with, what are the words of wisdom that you would impart upon them?
Yeah, I think it's connecting with community. It would be one of my biggest, like, pieces of advice. I think that talking to people and really connecting with individuals completely changes the way you can sort of see what the opportunities are and the potential is. And being intentional about how you're carving out space for exploring yourself, because it does take work. I don't think you can, there's a lot of emotional digging and bravery it takes to really go down this path. I think one thing that always got in my way when I was trying to further explore myself was this sense of guilt. Like, I didn't want to put pressure on my family. I didn't want to disappoint my mother. I didn't want to make it harder for whoever. And I think it really took coming back to myself and thinking, well, I'm doing all of this and I'm so concerned about everyone else's experience and everyone else's feelings, but I'm here suffering. And so, at some point you got to kind of choose yourself, I think, and be prepared to and have the bravery really to just kind of accept that if you are going to disappoint someone, or if that experience is going to happen through being who you are, then that's part of the journey. That's part of what it means for you to be who you are. Yeah,
that's amazing.
I think what's so relevant today is that we talk a lot about grit and how sometimes is getting to these points of quote unquote success, which let's say is someone sees you in your journey currently today as being successful, or having, for people to really understand that this is a continual journey.
Yeah. And
it really is putting in the hard work. It's about not just feeling the feelings that you go through, but also learning to support yourself, ask for the things that you need, and realize that you need to, self-care is so important, and setting those boundaries for yourself.
I think that's so true. And it's having the confidence that there are people out there that will be there to catch you and support you and love you. I think, like, meeting you, Anthony, is an example of just, like, that there are people all over the place that will give you space and a chance and will see you for who you are. You just have to first do that for yourself, for the other people to have the opportunity. And I think that's really been my experience thus far, is, like, just a whole world has opened up for me in a way that I didn't even expect. And I think even you guys having me on this podcast, it's such a privilege, because I think trans stories and queer stories are often relegated to those spaces, spaces that are specifically for queer or trans people. And I feel like this is a podcast that isn't really about queerness specifically, but yet I'm given the space to talk about my experience. I think that's really progress, and it's such a privilege to be a part of the conversation in that way.
Well, and that's all due to Jesse. Because
It's all
Jesse
good
had
to
this great idea.
Anthony had this great.
You
No,
both.
I just run with it. I hear
Yeah,
the great
fair
idea.
play.
I'm like, let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just run with it. He had the great idea. Like, let's go.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But
Yeah.
thank you so much for coming on to the show. And I mean, I just had a lot of identification. You know, you said you had a lot of identification with other folks, and you're kind of in your position where you're facing all these truths about yourself and accepting yourself and moving on and living a good life. And it's everything that I can identify in my own experience of life. You know, it's not the same circumstances, but the same feelings.
Totally.
Yeah. And that's a really powerful message. And I'm sure that there are folks listening that really appreciate that and are maybe struggling with this, and to hear, as you heard from others, that there is a power of example there is super, super important. So thank you.
Can I ask one last question?
Please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What words would you say, because you were born with a family that was really supportive, or born into a family that was very supportive, and you also had other family members that you had to negotiate with. What would be your words to anyone who maybe has a friend or someone who expresses that they are possibly transgendered? Because I'm assuming that generally when they come out, it's, well, I might be gay, I might be transgendered, I might, you know, there's a lot of this soft, let me dip my toe into the water and then sort of move along as you start realizing and start even voicing it to yourself. What would you tell someone who is that type of information shared with, and how should we best support these individuals?
Yeah. I think in my experience, the people what I noticed is that a lot of people started to do their own research around what I was going through. So, for example, my mother bought 3 books that were about parents dealing with trans kids. My cousins started to do research online and follow it, other trans people on Instagram, and became part of the community in a way that was through allyship. So I think it's about, taking the pressure off of the person who is going through the transition and sort of saying, okay, well, they've given me this information. Now it's kind of my responsibility to figure out what this actually means for that person. And I think the more research you can do, the more you can have informed questions, right? About what, I think everyone's kind of confused when someone's going through transition. I mean, I know I was confused at what is a trans person, and I am one. So I can only imagine what it is, to try to negotiate that when you don't have that experience. So I think just coming in with a little bit of effort, putting in effort yourself to have a bit of awareness when trying to negotiate your allyship for someone else is probably what I would say.
Cool. Are there any organizations that have supported you through this transition that you want to give a shout out to? Because I think you and I have chatted a little bit, and I know that there have been some organizations that have helped you tremendously.
Yeah.
Whether it be name changes, where you want to give accolade to.
Totally. I think that, the Mazzoni Center is my sort of hub of where I get my treatment from. It's my healthcare provider. It's also a community of, a social community. So I would really like to just shout out the Mazzoni Center. They're actually in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. They host a trans wellness, massive event every year. And they're really invested in helping trans people who are not necessarily able to access a lot of resources due to financial difficulties or other things. So I think it's really important that they're sort of out here for everyone in the community. Yeah.
Amazing. Cool. Emery, thank you so much for coming on the podcast itself. We want to just say thank you. It's such an honor for you to share your story. It was so great to just hear your story. And until next time,
I'm Jesse.
I'm Ant, and we'll talk to you later.
You did a little bit better that time. Thanks. See you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.